Chapter 8 of the Boy Scouts in the Blue Ridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. The Boy Scouts in the Blue Ridge by Herbert Carter. Chapter 8. Bob Confides in the Patrol Leader. "What I wanted to tell you about is my father," said Bob, swallowing something that seemed to be sticking in his throat, as though the mere mention of the dead parent had the power to affect him so. "Yes," Thad said encouragingly, wondering at the same time how one who had passed to the other side several years now could have any sort of connection with the mission of the scouts to this region. "You'll perhaps understand," continued Bob, getting a firmer grip on himself, "when I mention the fact that my father, for a year or so before he was taken, had filled the office of United States Marshal for this district." "Oh!" exclaimed Thad, beginning to see the light now. "He was induced to take the office by the President himself, who was a personal friend of my father," the boy went on proudly. "And having given his word, nothing could make him go back. Up to then we had lived at peace with everybody in the mountains, but of course that was bound to come to an end after he had sworn to do his duty, which was to send out his agents to destroy all the secret stills and bring in the lawbreakers if they could be found. He must soon have had the enmity of Old Phin and every other moonshiner about the Big Smokies," Thad remarked, the other having paused as though to give him a chance to express an opinion. "This is just what happened," Bob went on hurriedly, as, having broken the ice, he wanted to get through as speedily as possible, and after he had led several successful raids in person, the mountaineers saw that they had a different man to deal with from the other old marshal. They sent him terrible warnings of what was going to happen to him if he kept up his work. But my father was a Quail, and he didn't know the meaning of fear." "Were you and your mother living near here all that time, Bob?" asked the scoutmaster. "Because I should have thought she might have been worried for fear some of the desperate men tried to stop your father's work by, say, burning down his home, or doing something like that." "There were threats made to that effect, and my father moved his family to Asheville to feel that they would all be safe. Then there came the dreadful day for us, when my father never came back. After he had gone into the mountains to arrest another batch of moonshiners who still had been located, one of the men who had accompanied him told us he had seen him shot down. They were surrounded by bushwhackers, and the rifles were popping all about them. So they had to leave him there. He was surely dead, they claimed, before they fled from the spot, and of course they could not burden themselves with his body." Again Bob White paused to gulp down the obstacle in his throat. "Now you are wondering how it happened that when we came to Cranford there was this gentleman with us who was called Mr. Quail, and supposed to be my father. Well, that was my father's twin brother living in Philadelphia. He kindly offered to stay with my mother, who never goes out at all until we became settled. Her mother, my grandmother, had left me a heap of stock in the banks and mills of Cranford, and it was very unpleasant for my mother down this a ways. After father went, she determined to locate up yonder." "And does she know about you coming down here?" asked Thad, as if he feared that the other might have deceived the only parent he had left. This bringing a tragedy of grim mountains so close to home that gave them the scout leader considerable thrill, for after all, despite his courage and grit, Thad was only a boy. Bob drew himself up proudly, and his black eyes flashed. "I would sooner cut off my right hand than deceive my mother," he said. "And so you may understand the whole thing. I must tell you what a strange longing I've had been hugging in my heart these 2 years back. It is this: what if, after all, my father was not dead at the time his men saw him fall? What if these moonshiners had kept him a prisoner somewhere in the mountains all this time, meaning to punish him because he had given them so much trouble. "That's a stunning shock you've given me, Bob," said Thad, drawing a long breath. "But see here, is it just a wild wish to have it so, or have you any reason to believe in a thing? Any foundation for the theory, in fact?" "I'll tell you," Bob went on feverishly. "A man came to see me one day, and said he had been sent by one of the revenues who had been with my father that time, to tell me what he had picked up in the mountains. There were rumors going around that somewhere deep in the mountains, at one of the old stills, the Moonshiners kept a prisoner at work. Some said it must be one of the revenue men who had disappeared, and that the Moonshiners were bent on making him work up the mash, as a sort of punishment for having done them so much damage when he was an employee of the government." "I see, and of course you jumped to the conclusion that it might be your own father, alive and well, though held a prisoner of the Moonshiners." "Well, both my mother and myself believed that there might be just a little chance that way. She was in bad health, and put it all in my hands. We had never said a word about it to anybody in Cranford, while I have been going to school with the rest of the boys in Cranford. All the time I was in correspondence with one of the government revenue agents, and paying him to be on the constant watch for any positive signs. Well, he died 6 months ago, and just when he had begun to think he was getting on a warm scent." "I see," said Thad, as Bob paused, overcome with emotion. "And ever since then you've been longing to get down here again, to find out for yourself if it could be true." "Well, I don't blame you the least bit, Bob, and I only hope that you'll be able to learn the truth, even if it dashes all your hopes. Whatever we can do to help, you can count on us. Scouts have to be like brothers, you know. It's part of our regulations to help anyone in trouble, and that applies stronger than ever when it's a fellow scout." "Oh, thank you, Thad!" exclaimed the warm-hearted Southern lad, as he squeezed the hand of his companion almost fiercely. "I had no right to influence you to come down here. It's a dangerous place. Right now, I ought to beg you and the rest to back out, and leave me to fight my battles alone. But somehow I just can't find the grit to do that. I reckon I'm too selfish. I'm right ashamed of myself. Of course," continued wise Thad, "this old Moonshiner, Phin Dady, might still have it in for you as one of the Quail family. Oh, as far as that is concerned, I'm not bothering my head. I assure you I'd just snap my fingers under his nose. My idea in wanting to keep him from seeing me was along another line. He would be apt to think, like father, like son, and that I had hired out to the government to find where his still lay, so it could be raided. No man has ever done that. Phin declares they never will. If these mountaineers begin to get bothersome, it might interfere some with the other little affair you spoke about," suggested Thad, as they continued to walk on in company. "Oh, that's what I'm afraid of," replied Bob White. "But I'm hoping for the best." Some of the others happened to join up about that time, and bring the confidential conversation to a close. But surely the young scout leader had plenty to ponder over as he walked on. The hike through the Blue Ridge, which they had looked forward to simply as a test of endurance and to develop their knowledge of woodcraft, threatened to turn into a tragic affair. At least, it was no child's play, and if they came out of it without any serious accidents happening to any of their numbers, they would be deserving of great credit. But if Thad and Bob White were in a serious frame of mind, the same could hardly be said of several other members of the patrol. Giraffe, Step Hen, Bumpus seemed to be fairly bubbling over with good humor. Some boys can no more control their spirits than they can their appetites. As usual, Step Hen suddenly discovered, while they were halting for a breathing spell, that he was minus something. The evil spirits had evidently been at work again, when he was off guard, and succeeded in abstracting part of his personal property. It really was a shame how they beset that unlucky fellow. "If it doesn't just beat the Dutch what happened to me," he was heard to loudly wail, looking around him in a helpless way. "What's the matter now, Step Hen?" asked Allan, although he knew full well what sort of an answer he must receive. "They've been and done it some more," replied the disturbed scout helplessly. The trouble was that whenever he missed something, Step Hen always ran around looking in all the places that no sensible person would ever dream of examining. When Giraffe declared that he was like an old hen with his head cut off, it just about fitted the case. "What's gone this time?" continued the boy from Maine, with a smile at the way Step Hen was turning over small stones, and stirring the leaves with his foot, as if he really expected a miracle to be wrought, and to find a bulky object that way. "That little kodak I fetched along, I had it wrapped up as carefully in waterproof cloth, and tied with a top cord. Now it's gone. Needn't spring that old story on me, and say I was careless. Perhaps I have been a few times, but right now I'm dead sure the fault isn't mine. Somebody's playing a joke on me, mind. I ain't mentioning no names, but I got my suspicion." He looked hard at Giraffe, and the accusation could hardly have been given in plainer language than that. But Giraffe was used to being unjustly accused. Oh, there were occasions when he did seize upon a golden opportunity to hide something belonging to his comrade, because it had been left carelessly around; and Giraffe believed it part of his duty to break the other of such shiftless habits. But on this occasion he held up both hands, declaring solemnly, "I give you my word for it, I never touched any camera. This time either you've been and dropped it on the road, or else the gold dust winds have nabbed it on you." Just then Bumpus, who had been wandering aimlessly about after drinking the cooling waters of the little spring that had been the main cause of this temporary halt in the march, gave utterance to a loud exclamation. He had tripped over something that lay in the grass, and a splash announced that with his usual hard luck, the fat boy had managed to go headlong into the spring. Scrambling out, with the water streaming from his red face, he turned indignantly on the balance of the patrol, now convulsed with laughter. "What sort of horseplay did you call that, I'd like to know?" he sputtered, trying to wipe his streaming face with a handkerchief that looked far too small for the task. "Can't a feller just stroll around camp without some silly putting out a foot and tripping him up? Tell me that, now. I'm beginning to think we must have some sort of hoodoo along with us," remarked Smithy. "All sorts of things have been happening, and in the most mysterious way possible. We all know there isn't a single fellow anywhere near Bumpus when he pitched forward. Yet he says somebody put out a foot, and he tripped over it. I think it's a remarkable phenomenon, for a fact, and worth investigating." "Well, something did trip me, and that's sure," grumbled Bumpus, possibly thinking he had been too sweeping in his accusations. "Suppose you look at that bunch of grass, and find out if the little evil spirit that's playing all these pranks on you is lying there," suggested Thad, with a twinkle in his eye, as though he could give a pretty shrewd guess what the result of said exploration would turn out to be. So Bumpus, always willing to oblige, especially since his own curiosity must have been aroused, proceeded forthwith to get down on his hands and knees, and began an examination of the tangle in question. Half a minute later he gave out a loud cry. At the same time he was seen to hold up some strange black object. "Look, Bumpus has caught his little evil genius!" cried Giraffe. "And it ain't hard looking subject, though. Caught him right by the ankle, and threw him straight into our spring. We're lucky we had all drink we wanted before he started to wash there." "If it ain't my kodak!" ejaculated Step Hen faintly, as though it shocked him to think how his lost camera should have been lying there all in that tangle of grass, where it had undoubtedly fallen as he prepared to take his turn bending over the water hole. Of course everybody laughed, for they could guess what had happened. Step Hen's little failings were an everyday occurrence, as Giraffe had often declared. The careless one would have long since lost his head if had not a kind nature secured it to his body. The march was resumed, with Thad lecturing Step Hen on his prevailing sin, and as usual Step Hen solemnly promised to be more careful the next time. But he had a very slippery mind, and the chances were that before nightfall he'd be up to his old tricks again, accusing the rest of playing a prank by hiding some of his possessions. "There's a man sitting on that rock up there watching us," said Davy Jones, in a tone that thrilled them all. "A regular mountaineer, too," added Smithy, "just as I've pictured them often, with butternut jean trousers, a ragged woolen shirt open at the neck, and an old hat on his frowsy head. Boys, he seems to have a gun in his possession, too." They were a little uneasy as they passed along, but the lone man seemed to simply watch the squad of uniformed scouts without making any hostile move. "Chances are," remarked Davy Jones, after they lost sight of the man, "he had some sort of vidette or sentry posted up there to keep an eye on the trail, and if any suspicious characters came along, to send word to the other moonshiners. I understand they can telegraph all right without the aid of instruments, or even the latest wireless outfit. How about that, Bob?" "Yes, it is so," replied the Southern boy. "They do it by making smoke, or sometimes by sounds that are passed along from one station to another. It's queer how fast a message can be relayed that way." "Well," remarked Thad, "that's the method used by the blacks in Africa, and they do say they can send news of a battle faster than white men can get it along by relays of telegraph stations, with breaks where a carrier has to be used." "Are we getting anywhere close to the place you said old Reuben lived at, Bob?" asked Bumpus, who was showing signs of being tired. "Another hour would take us to where we can look across this wonderful little valley, and we see the place," Bob answered. "You will be surprised, for nobody would ever think so fine a house could be found among these wild mountains. But as I told you before, Reuben Sparks seems never to have been molested by the moonshiners. Most people believe he is a secret partner in the business. Say, would you look yonder, where the road comes around that spur back of us? To think of seeing a real buggy, and a flesh and blood horse, and the back of the animal a gentleman and a lady. I'm sure dreaming," remarked Giraffe. "Not a bit of it, you ain't, because I see them myself," added Step Hen, eagerly. "And unless my eyes deceive me, we've met that gentleman before," said Allan. "Yes," remarked Bob, with trembling voice, "it's Reuben Sparks, and that must be my little cousin Bertha." End of Chapter 8. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan.